what if the defining medical crisis of our lifetime wasn't actually a medical crisis at all?
I mean, that is just an incredibly bold premise right out of the gate.
It really is. It fundamentally challenges, the accepted reality of the past few years.
Oh, absolutely.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to explore this highly controversial, intricately detailed 2021 book by Iain Davis. It's called Pseudopandemic, Normal Technocracy.
Right, and before we jump into the deep end here, let's establish some ground rules for you, the listener.
Good idea.
Because this material contains some highly charged, deeply provocative claims about global governance, public health, and, well, everything that happened in 2020.
Yeah, and we need to be clear, we are not taking sides today. We aren't endorsing these claims,
At all.
and we aren't debunking them either. Our mission is purely to help you understand the author's central arguments, the specific evidence presented in the text.
Exactly. For the duration of this deep dive, we are basically just stepping inside the architecture of this book.
And architecture is actually the perfect word for it. The book asks us to view the global health system not as this series of independent hospitals and governments, but more like a rigged casino.
A rigged casino, right?
Yeah. Like you walk in, the lights are flashing, the doctors and scientists look incredibly professional, and you think, hey, I'm playing a fair game.
But this text argues that a very small group of people actually owns the house.
Right. They control the deck, they fund the dealers, and they write the rules.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand this whole claim of a rigged global casino, we first have to understand the philosophical framework the text builds regarding human rights.
Yeah, because if the ultimate goal of this operation was a massive global power grab, we have to look at what was allegedly being grabbed in the first place.
Right. And to do that, the author makes a very deliberate distinction between two concepts that most people, frankly, just use interchangeably.
You mean inalienable rights and human rights?
Yes. So the premise here is that inalienable rights are natural, immutable, and you are literally just born with them.
They're tied to natural law.
Exactly. It's the inherent knowledge that you own your body,
Yeah.
and it's wrong for someone to harm or coerce you. You don't need a piece of paper or, like, a government decree to tell you that.
But human rights, as defined in this framework, are completely different. They are political constructs. They're just written on paper by governments.
Yeah.
As I was reading through this, I kept thinking about it like this. Human rights are basically that massive revocable software license agreement you blindly click accept on when you update your phone.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Like the company can just change the terms of service whatever they want and suddenly you're locked out. But inalienable rights are the physical hardware.
The actual phone.
Yeah, the phone itself that you actually own, you paid for it, you hold it in your hand. No one can just update a document and make your physical phone vanish.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the argument, because a software license can, and absolutely is, suspended.
Yeah, and the text points directly to Article 29 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights to prove this exact vulnerability.
Right, because Article 29 explicitly states that these rights and freedoms can be limited for the purpose of meeting the, quote, just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare.
So there's the loophole. If the government decides there is a threat to public order or, a threat to the general welfare, all those beautiful human rights written on paper can legally just be turned off.
Just turned off. And that loophole brings us to the title of the book itself, Pseudopandemic.
Now, we need to be really careful here. It is critical to understand what this word means in the context of the text.
Yeah, it does not mean the virus is a hoax.
Exactly. The text explicitly acknowledges that a virus circulated, people got sick, some seriously, and sadly, many died.
But the term pseudopandemic is used to argue that the threat level of this relatively low mortality respiratory virus was fraudulently, intentionally exaggerated.
Exaggerated to trigger that Article 29 loophole.
Exactly. The idea is that the public was terrorized into compliance so the software license could be revoked.
What's fascinating here is how this philosophical shift, moving from immutable natural rights to conditional human rights, allows governments to fundamentally change their relationship with the public.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. Instead of existing to protect citizens, the state begins to view citizens as, well, biohazards.
Biohazards, just your mere existence.
Right, your breathing, your proximity to another human being, it's all framed as a deadly threat to the collective. And to manage these walking biohazards, the authorities transition us into what the text calls a biosecurity state.
Okay, so you redefine rights, you exaggerate a threat, and you create a biosecurity state. But, I mean, let's be real for a second here.
Sure.
How do you actually pull that off without millions of people blowing the whistle? If this was manufactured, you're talking about a conspiracy involving every doctor, nurse, and health official on Earth.
It sounds impossible.
The logistics of that seem completely impossible.
And they would be impossible if you had to control everyone. But the architecture of influence detailed here doesn't require millions of people sitting in smoke-filled rooms.
Okay, so how does it work?
It relies on a hierarchy and a concept called compartmentalization. The argument is that a very small, incredibly wealthy group, the author calls them the core conspirators, sits at the absolute top of a global public-private partnership.
A GPPP.
Right, GPPP. In this model, national governments aren't really sovereign anymore. They basically just act as state franchises for this larger global corporate and financial network.
So who is actually executing the plan if the doctors aren't in on it?
Beneath the core conspirators is a very small cadre of what the text calls informed influencers.
Okay.
The text points to figures at the top of global institutions, like the World Health Organization's Director General, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, as potential examples. These are the managers.
And below them.
Then you have the deceived influencers. That's the vast majority of scientists, doctors, nurses, and local politicians.
So they genuinely believe the exaggerated threat?
Exactly. They aren't evil. They are just following the science and genuinely trying to help.
Look, I have to stop you there and push back a little on behalf of the listener, because it still sounds like a massive leap to say a few billionaires or a tiny global elite can just magically dictate global health.
It does sound like a leap.
Right. I mean, you can't just send out a memo to millions of doctors telling them to practice bad medicine. How exactly does this influence actually trickle down to the emergency room?
Well, it all comes down to financial leverage and the control of something called Apex Research.
Apex Research.
Let's look at how the funding actually works at the WHO. Around 80% of their budget doesn't come from mandatory dues from countries.
Wait, really? 80%?
Yeah, 80% comes from voluntary contributions. The text details how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with connected entities like the GAVI Vaccine Alliance, effectively act as the largest financial contributors to the WHO.
Yeah, so they have immense leverage.
Exactly. Now, when you control the voluntary funding, you get to dictate what gets researched. You fund the Apex research.
So that's like the massive multi-million-dollar clinical trials and models that get published in the top medical journals.
Right. And because that Apex research is considered the gold standard, it just automatically becomes official policy.
Wow. So the deceived influencers further down the chain, the local doctors and health boards, they don't have the billions of dollars to conduct their own alternate global studies?
Nope. They simply follow the accepted science handed down from above. You don't need to bribe a million healthcare workers.
You just fund the studies that produce the results you want, and the system regulates itself.
Exactly.
And what blew my mind reading this was the closed loop of it all. These same philanthropic entities funding the WHO are simultaneously heavily invested in pharmaceutical companies.
Like Pfizer.
Yes, like Pfizer. It's a structure where public tax dollars, private philanthropy, and corporate profits completely merge.
Precisely. And the text connects this massive financial engine directly to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs.
Wait, aren't sustainability goals a good thing? I mean, ending poverty, clean water, global health.
Well, they are marketed with incredibly benevolent buzzwords like equality and resilience. But the text argues their actual functional purpose is to create massive, mandated, disruptive markets.
So it's about forcing a market to exist.
Right. Let's say the UN issues a goal for, quote, equitable global health resilience. Sounds great.
Yeah, nobody's against that.
But the mandates required to meet that global goal force national governments to purchase billions of dollars in patent surveillance technology, digital ID infrastructure, and pharmaceutical products.
And they buy them from the exact private corporations sitting at that GTPP table.
Exactly. The author argues it's not charity. It is an orchestrated trillion-dollar wealth transfer.
That they control the funding, they control the global health mandates, and they set the rules of the game. But I mean, science is still science. A doctor knows what a pandemic is. An immunologist knows how the human body fights a virus. How do you trick the entire global medical community into thinking the sky is falling when the mortality rate doesn't match the panic?
You change the dictionary. Literally.
What do you mean?
A crucial pillar of this entire operation relies on shifting the definitions of core scientific concepts. The text documents how the WHO quietly altered key definitions to suit the required narrative.
Oh, like the definition of a pandemic.
Yes. For instance, before the 2009 H1N1 outbreak, the official definition of a pandemic required, quote, enormous numbers of deaths and illness.
And they changed that.
The WHO removed that phrase entirely. Under the new definition, a disease doesn't have to be highly lethal to be a pandemic. It just has to spread worldwide.
And they did the exact same thing with herd immunity in 2020.
They did.
The text shows how the WHO changed the definition of herd immunity on their website to state that it is a concept used only for vaccination.
Which is wild.
It is. They completely erased the foundational century-old scientific concept of natural immunity developed through previous infection.
And the argument is they did that because by changing the definitions, you artificially constrain the viable solutions.
Right. If natural immunity doesn't count and the threshold for declaring a pandemic is lowered to just widespread transmission,
then the only acceptable exit strategy from the crisis becomes a global mandated vaccination program.
but there is a major hurdle there. To ensure that highly profitable global vaccination program happens, you have to eliminate the competition.
Exactly, because if there are cheap, highly effective cures already on the pharmacy shelf, people don't need a rushed experimental vaccine.
And this leads to the suppression of generic treatments. The text goes into excruciating detail about the coordinated effort to sabotage clinical trials for cheap, unpatented, over-the-counter drugs.
Drugs like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and high-dose vitamin D.
Yeah, and the mechanism of that sabotage is startling.
It really is. The text cites how the WHO used a blatantly fraudulent paper published in the Lancet Medical Journal.
The Surgisphere paper.
Right, provided by a shadowy, tiny data company called Surgisphere. They used that paper to immediately halt global trials of hydroxychloroquine.
And the data in the paper was completely fabricated. It was so flawed, it was eventually retracted.
But it didn't matter. The global headlines had already been written, the trials were stopped, and the drug was successfully painted as dangerous.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when clinical trials for these alternative drugs did eventually continue, the text argues they were intentionally designed to fail.
Yeah, this part is dark. Let's look at the UK's recovery trial for hydroxychloroquine.
Right, because the safe, widely established protocol for using this drug, known globally as the Marseille Protocol, calls for 600 milligrams a day.
Combined with zinc and antibiotics.
Exactly, and administered in the very early stages of illness.
That is the crucial context. It's a low dose, given early.
Yes, but in the recovery trial, they gave patients who were already severely, critically ill in the hospital a staggering 2,400 milligrams on the first day.
Which is 4 times the safe recommended dose.
4 times. The author doesn't mince words here. He literally calls it a lethal dose. The argument is that they intentionally poison these patients to make a remarkably safe drug look incredibly deadly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying motive for this suppression becomes crystal clear.
Okay, lay it out.
Why go to such extreme, potentially criminal lengths to bury cheap, generic drugs? Because of the legal structure of emergency use authorizations, or EUAs.
Ah.
For pharmaceutical companies to get an EUA for their brand new patented vaccines, there legally cannot be an adequate, approved, available alternative treatment.
Wow. So if a $3 generic pill works, the multi-billion-dollar vaccine authorizations just vanish.
They vanish entirely.
And if those vaccines vanish, the entire endgame falls apart, because without the vaccine mandate, you can't implement the biometric ID system.
The digital vaccine passports.
Exactly. The passports that the core conspirators needed to establish the foundational infrastructure of the biosecurity state. It is all deeply interconnected.
It really is a domino effect. But, you've hit on the final, most important hurdle.
What's that?
You've rewritten the definitions, you've sidelined the cheap treatments, and you have your vaccine infrastructure ready. But none of that matters if the public isn't absolutely terrified.
Right, because a virus with a relatively low mortality rate simply doesn't cause global society-halting panic naturally. People see that their neighbors aren't dropping dead in the streets.
So how do you convince billions of people they are in mortal danger?
You manufacture the statistics. Which brings us to the core of the illusion, the testing.
The testing.
The argument here is that the primary tool used to generate these terrifying daily ticker tapes of doom on the news was the RT-PCR test.
But there is a massive fundamental flaw with how this test was used. Let's explain the biology here for a second.
Go for it.
The PCR test detects genetic sequences. It does not diagnose an active infectious disease. It basically acts like a massive photocopier for DNA and RNA.
Yeah, and the text actually quotes Kary Mullis, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist who invented the PCR process.
What did he say?
He famously warned that PCR is a manufacturing technique, not a diagnostic tool. He explicitly said that if you amplify it enough, PCR can, quote, find almost anything in anybody.
And the mechanism of this manipulation relies on what are called cycle thresholds, or seat values. Think of a cycle as hitting copy and enlarge on a photocopier.
Okay.
The global standard for COVID testing was the Corman-Drosten protocol, which ran these PCR tests at up to 45 or 50 amplification cycles.
Which is huge.
It's massive. At that extreme level of magnification, you are no longer finding active, whole infectious virus. You are amplifying microscopic, dead viral fragments and background genetic noise.
You're finding the biological debris of an infection you beat months ago?
Exactly.
Let's do the math together right now, because this is where the statistical illusion really snaps into focus.
Let's hear it.
The text cites the UK government's own scientific advisory group, which estimated these PCR tests had a median false positive rate of 2.3%.
Right, which sounds small until you scale it up.
Exactly. Imagine a city tests 100,000 perfectly healthy people today. With a 2.3% false positive rate, 2,300 of those healthy people will be told they have a deadly virus.
Right. Now multiply that by millions of tests administered every single day across the globe.
Suddenly, the news is screaming about a massive, terrifying surge in cases, but the hospitals are largely empty.
Because the vast majority of all reported cases, according to the statistical math in this book, were simply false.
And this false data feeds directly into the most damaging psychological weapon of the entire pseudopandemic.
The myth of the asymptomatic spreader.
Yes, the idea that perfectly healthy, symptom-free people were actually walking biological weapons.
This was the justification for literally everything.
It was, and the text cites a massive, definitive study conducted in Wuhan, China, right at the epicenter. They tested nearly 10 million people.
10 million. That is the population of a small country.
Out of those 10 million, they found around 300 asymptomatic positive cases. They then vigorously tracked all of their close contacts, over 1,000 people.
And then the result.
They found exactly 0 instances of asymptomatic transmission, not one.
0.
The scientific data showed that if you didn't have symptoms, you weren't spreading the disease.
I want you to think about this for a second, listening to this right now. If a person tests positive, but has absolutely 0 symptoms, and massive 10 million person studies show they don't spread the virus to anyone else.
Why were entire populations of healthy people ordered to lock themselves inside their homes?
This raises an important question. If lockdowns weren't actually scientifically justified by asymptomatic spread, what was their real purpose?
It's a good question.
Because the text is brutal when it looks at the modeling used to justify them. It points to Imperial College's Report 9, spearheaded by Neil Ferguson.
Oh, right. The book calls his computer models junk code.
Junk code. And it highlights his long history of wildly inaccurate doomsday predictions for bird flu and swine flu that just never materialized.
But those models were used everywhere.
They were. The author contrasts those bleak computer models with actual real-world data to prove lockdowns were a catastrophic failure as a public health tool.
Yeah, the text compares countries side by side. It looks at places with some of the harshest, most draconian lockdowns in the world, like the UK and Belgium.
Right.
Then it compares their mortality rates to non-lockdown countries like Belarus, or places with incredibly light voluntary restrictions like Sweden.
And the data shows that strict lockdowns did not reduce mortality.
At all. The virus followed its natural curve regardless of whether people were locked in their apartments or sitting in a cafe.
In fact, the argument goes much further. The text shows that keeping healthy people indoors, halting routine cancer screenings and medical care, and utterly destroying the global economy caused immense, measurable excess mortality.
People died because of the lockdowns.
Yes. So why do it?
Well, the text quotes a Belgian health minister who bluntly admitted that lockdown measures were used as a, quote, psychological shock tactic.
Cough shock tactic.
The lockdowns weren't a medical intervention. They were a compliance mechanism. They were designed to break down social cohesion, crush independent, middle-class businesses, and condition citizens to accept the constant surveillance.
The digital checkpoints.
Exactly. And the behavioral control of the new biosecurity state.
It was an exercise in learned helplessness, a way to traumatize the population so deeply that they would actually beg for the revocable software license of conditional human rights as long as it meant they were allowed to go outside again.
Wow. We have covered a massive, intense amount of ground today. Let's pull this sweeping narrative
Oh,
together.
let's do it.
The central argument of this incredibly detailed book is that a respiratory virus with a relatively low mortality rate was ruthlessly exploited.
Through financial leverage over global health institutions.
And the altering of basic scientific definitions, the intentional suppression of cheap cures, the manipulation of PCR testing to create false statistics, and economically destructive lockdowns.
Also, a core group of elites could execute a massive transfer of wealth and power.
And perhaps most importantly, they successfully conditioned humanity to accept a totalitarian, permission-based society where your fundamental, inalienable rights have been quietly replaced by conditional privileges.
So what does this all mean?
Look, Iain Davis's Pseudopandemic is a heavy, controversial text. It totally upends the accepted mainstream narrative we've all lived through.
It really does.
But engaging with challenging, meticulously structured perspectives like this is exactly why we do these deep dives. It forces us to examine our own assumptions about authority, the integrity of global science, and the true nature of our rights.
Absolutely. And I think there is a broader, vital implication here to leave you with.
What's that?
If we assume, just as an intellectual exercise, that the framework detailed in this book is correct, that the vast architecture for a global biosecurity state is now fully built, technologically tested, and largely accepted by a traumatized public.
An architecture where your ability to travel, work, or buy food is treated as a conditional privilege based on your compliance with emergency decrees.
Exactly. If that machinery is sitting there, fully operational, what other global issues might be used in the future to pull those exact same emergency levers?
Oh, that's a chilling thought.
Could we see a declared climate emergency or an energy crisis used to justify new lockdowns, restrict your travel, or mandate digital tracking using the exact same playbook we just lived through?
It's a thought that really sticks with you. When the landscape gets this manipulated, when the lines between public health, global finance, and absolute political control blur this heavily, you have to ask yourself, who is actually running the casino? And when they tell you the odds are in your favor, what are they choosing not to tell you?